sliced through the Stygian darkness at the embankment of the bridge that crossed the Trinity River. He was there with his partner. They were just doing their duty. In its wisdom, our wonderful elected members of the Dallas City Council had decided that the people who had taken up residence under that bridge were desecrating the beauty of our downtown Dallas. And so they had ordered our police to move those people along. So the police officer and his partner, doing their duty, went from one figure to another. And they moved along the destitute, the mentally ill, the druggie, the drunk, just doing their duty, waking them up, and when they were in some form of consciousness, sending them shambling, staggering away. Move along. Move along. Where? They were just doing their duty. Until that policeman's flashlight shined on one figure under that bridge that was smaller than the rest. And when that teenage boy awakened to that light and saw the blue uniform, he began to cry. And suddenly, that police officer forgot all about his duty because he had a teenage son about the same age. And he motioned his partner along. And he sat down on the concrete and he began to talk to that boy. And the story he heard was an old story. An old story about anger and misunderstanding, about a rebellious young man and a stiff-necked father. He heard about a horrible night. A night when poisonous words were said. I hate you. I wish you were dead. This is not a story about murder. But in the dead of that night, the boy had very quietly crept into his father's bedroom and purloined his father's wallet and his car keys, and he went out and got in that car and drove away from St. Louis, Missouri toward freedom. He freely used his father's credit cards for a few days until he realized that he was leaving a trail of exactly where he had been. And then in a back room of some place, he sold those credit cards for a little bit of cash. He drove south and he drove west. And by the time he had reached Dallas, Texas, that little bit of money was gone and all of the bills in his father's wallet had disappeared. But he was a pretty smart boy. He found a man on a back street who didn't ask any questions and didn't ask for a title, and he sold that car. And he was flush again for a few weeks. And then the money was gone. And it is not too far a journey from that moment to living under a bridge over the Trinity River. When the police officer heard that story, he called to his partner. He said, we've got someplace to go. And he told that boy, you pick up your few belongings, you're coming with me. And he put him in the back of that patrol car. And he drove to a building off of Harry Hines Boulevard, the Children's Emergency Night Shelter. And the officer said to the boy, you wait here, and he got out and knocked on the door. And in response, a weary child caseworker came to that door. And the police officer explained the situation. Now that caseworker was a kind man. He was a kind man. But he got a rueful smile, and the word that he said to that police officer was no. He said, you got to understand, we are overfull tonight. We have abused children laying on mats in the hallway because we don't have enough beds tonight. We cannot take a teenage runaway, especially one who's a thief. And the police officer returned to the patrol car. And he didn't get in the front this time. He got in the back. He sat and talked quietly with the boy. And he said, son, I can think of another option, but you're going to have to take responsibility. Are you ready to do that? And the boy nodded his head. So the police officer got behind the wheel and he drove to the next building over from the Children's Emergency Night Shelter. The next morning, I drove down Harry Hines and I turned into the parking lot of the Dallas Juvenile Detention Center. I was a newly hired assistant district attorney. They had just given me my new photo ID proving that. And I was there doing my duty that morning. I was there for juvenile detention hearings. Now, a juvenile detention hearing is when the judge comes out to the juvenile lockup and he hears the cases of all the young people who have been arrested the day before, and he makes a determination as to whether or not they're going to stay right there or whether they're going to be released. The detention center was not a big facility either. So I have to tell you, most of those juveniles, they came in and they went out. Well, they went out unless they were determined to be an absolute danger to the community, or unless a parent or guardian wasn't there to take them. So I got out of my car, locked it securely with my brand new, oh wait, it smelled good, leather briefcase in my hand, and my ID that I dug out of my pocket. I went to a steel door and I pressed a button, and that door went buzz and it swung open, and I stepped into a tiny anteroom as that steel door slammed shut behind me, and to my left was a thick sheet of plexiglass, and behind it was a juvenile detention officer. And I showed him my ID card, and I had to open up my briefcase even after that and show him I did not have any contraband or any weapons in it, and I snapped it shut, and he pushed a button, and there was a buzz, and a second steel door opened up, and I stepped into the waiting room for the courtroom, and that steel door slammed shut behind me. I was an assistant district attorney for almost 10 years. I never, ever got used to the sound of that steel door slamming shut behind me, and I knew I could leave. Let me describe the waiting room for the courtroom. In front of me was the door into the courtroom, but off to my left were a series of lightweight folding chairs set up. Those four were for parents or guardians or anyone else that was coming to a hearing. Further to the left was the Juvenile Detention Center, juvenile officer's office, and next to it was the DA's office. It will surprise you to know that the DA's office and the detention officer's office had glass walls. Does that surprise you? If you looked carefully, you would see why they were able to do that. Because not only was that glass thick, it was embedded with chicken wire. And that was because occasionally chairs got thrown in that waiting room. Occasionally people's bodies got flung in that waiting room. And that was so that if a chair or a body hit that glass, it would not shatter and become some kind of weapon. I stepped into my office. There was a thick stack of arrest reports of juveniles that had been arrested the previous day. And I began to go through those reports. I had just read a report, kind of unusual, about a kid from out of town, a teenage runaway car thief who the police had turned in the previous night. And after I read that and turned that report to go to the next one, Mr. Lee, one of the juvenile officers, appeared at my door. And he leaned in and said, "Can I use your phone?" And I knew what that meant. There were two phones near the courtroom that you could make a long distance call from. One was in the officer's office and one was in the DA's office. And I looked through the chicken glass wire and I could see somebody was on the phone in the detention center office. So I said, "Sure." And I pushed my chair back. It was not a big office, but I pushed my chair back. And Mr. Lee escorted in a gaunt, hollow-eyed boy. And he picked up the phone and he began to dial. You're old enough to know a rotary phone. I haven't explained this to anybody. This was 45 years ago. It was a rotary phone, desk set. And I swear, I tried not to eavesdrop. I mean, I understand confidentiality and all that. I was a young DA, but I understood that. And I tried not to eavesdrop. It was a tiny office. So I heard every word of the telephone conversation, at least one side of it. And this is how it went. Dad, it's me, Jim. I'm in the juvenile jail in Dallas, Texas. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for everything. Will you come and get me? I want to go home. And then there was a pause. And that boy put the handset back on the cradle, and he turned to Mr. Lee, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hands, and he said he wouldn't even talk with me. I remember that. It was a really easy hearing. There was no parent there. That boy was going to be detained. And he was. The next morning, I pulled into the parking lot at the detention center once again, just doing my duty that day. Got out of my car with my new briefcase and my ID card. Got busted, still had to open the briefcase and show them the second day I'd been there, show them I didn't have contraband or weapons. And I went into the waiting area. When I stepped through that second door, I didn't notice the door slamming shut behind me as much. What caught my eye was there were two people already there. They were really early for the detention hearings. So I glanced at them when I was going to my office. There was an older man sitting there. He was bent over in that chair. He was holding his head with his hands. He looked exhausted. And I have to tell you, may have been the first time I really noticed it. Oh boy, I saw it a lot. I looked at his complexion, his skin. Kind of an odd thing to notice, but he had the strangest skin. It looked like old parchment. I would come to learn that that kind of complexion came from someone who had spent too many sleepless nights smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee, worrying. Next to the older man was a young man. Looked like he was college age. And he was big. I mean, think college football player big. He was a handsome young man because I looked at his face. He wasn't holding his head in his hands. And I definitely noticed something about him. His mouth was a slash of anger. Trust me, you can be a young attorney and know that you better watch angry people in a courtroom setting. So I went in my office and trying to keep from worrying, I started looking through the police reports. While I was doing that, some more people came in, and that's when the juvenile officers brought in the prisoners whose hearings were going to be that day. And when I heard the door open, I looked up, and it was a good thing, because I otherwise would have been scared to death. That man who had been holding his head when they brought in the prisoners, he gave a cry. And he unfolded from that chair, and that's how I knew where the boy next to him had gotten his size. And that man leapt forward, and he embraced, covered the young boy who had used the phone in my office the other day. And that's when Mr. Lee, again, seemingly magically, appeared at my office door. He leaned in with a huge grin on his face, and he said, "That's his dad." He said, "After the hearing yesterday, I was concerned, and so I called again." His father wasn't angry. His father got so choked with emotion when he heard his son's voice that he couldn't speak. Jim hung up too soon. And that's when I did something that wasn't part of my duty. As a matter of fact, it was stupid. It was something I would never have done had I been a more well-trained attorney. I got up and I left my office and I went and sat beside that angry big young man, and I introduced myself as the prosecutor in the case, and I said what was obvious. I said, "It's clear that your dad does not want to press charges in this case, and since you all are here all the way from St. Louis, obviously your brother is going to be released." And I was naive enough to be startled when that handsome, big boy's face turned toward me, twisted, and he said, "I don't care if you bury him under the jail. You don't know what it's been like for my father these past months. You don't know. But then he turned his eyes from me toward his brother and his dad, still embracing them. Long hug. And I saw from the side until he turned back, that hard face softened. And he looked at me and he said, "Look at him. Look how happy he is. He's probably going to let Jim drive our new car some of the way back to St. Louis. Mister, that's my dad. That's my dad."
Wow.